Je parle des pierres plus âgées que la vie et qui demeurent après elles sur les planètes refroidies, qu'ont-elles eu la fortune d'y éclore. Je parle des pierres qui n'ont même pas à attendre la mort et qui n'ont rien à faire que laisser glisser sur leur surface le sable, l'averse ou le ressac, la tempête, le temps.
To begin this visit with you today, François, I wanted to ask you why you chose this agate for the exhibition poster. Well, this agate seemed to us to be a common choice, a common decision, as it reflected the poetry of Roger Caillois, especially when he was in Argentina. He had known the great icy deserts of Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia when he was in exile during the Second World War, and afterwards when he bought stones back in Paris. Among others, he bought stones that reminded him precisely of his past. So Roger Caillois was born in 1913, who died in 1978. He was an essayist and sociologist. He worked on festivities, games, and also the fantastic, a poet, as you said, an illustrious unknown person, but above all, an immortal, since he entered the Académie Française in 1971. And he wrote various works, about 60 in total, but we can quote, among others, Pierre, L'écriture des pierres, Agathe paradoxale, and his works which were inspired by his collection of stones. And so perhaps we can mention L'Écriture des pierres, which is one of his important works. Yes, L'Écriture des pierres is truly the work which, along with Pierre, was to contribute greatly to his election to the Académie Française, as you were saying, in 1971. And especially in L'Écriture des pierres, there are two aspects, one of which you mentioned, and in fact you made me realize that in 1970, publishing books on minerals with color pictures was extremely rare. It was truly novel, and it was done very little. It was done a lot in the art world, of course, but on minerals, very little. And this book was to be a great success, because with the already somewhat poetic text, one feels Roger Caillois' poetic verve emerging in this work. A modest work, about 100 pages, but there are about 30 or 40 color illustrations that allow a better understanding of the author's intentions as a sociologist, but he's also someone who is beginning to become a poet. And this illustrated book was to contribute to the success of Roger Caillois. It was translated into many languages, into Japanese, and during his lifetime, which is quite a rare occurrence, especially for a French author, and then into Spanish, German, and English. Well, this is very interesting. When I prepared the conference with you, I found an article in Le Monde where this work is discussed from a literary point of view, where it is mentioned that Roger Caillois is said to have one of the most beautiful collections in Paris. Well, one of the most beautiful private collections. Perhaps there's the museum and the École des Mines as well to be mentioned. But what is interesting is that it was a collection that until then had not been seen by the general public. It was private. It was just for Roger Caillois' close circle of friends. Yes, and in the select world of the literati of the left bank, Paris, the Café des Fleurs, writing about minerals was not the most common theme. So indeed, this was like an unidentified flying object, a UFO. It was a piece of innovation, something totally novel in the literary world, to have written and illustrated a text with poetry on minerals. And so, as you said, that's what was to lead to his becoming a member of the Académie. And the Académie, of course, means a sword, a ceremonial sword. And indeed, it was his great friend Jean Vendôme, the jeweler, also known as the father of contemporary jewelry, who was to produce an absolutely incredible sword. An innovation, Laetitia, a real innovation. So what's interesting, actually, is that we can find many symbols in this very different sword. We find an elbate tourmaline part. That's one of the mineral species of tourmaline that refers to Brazil, of course, to South America, which is close to his heart, which is also a gift from Jean Vendôme. And we'll find also the octopus, which is his, well, perhaps not fetish animal, but important to him in terms of symbolism. And it's very recurrent. And there it is, made with pyrope garnets on a dendrite quartz. We can also find a moldavite, a symbol of space, since moldavite comes from the impact of a meteorite, that melts matter and creates this material. And we can see this moldavite at the very bottom on the pommel. Yes, so moldavite representing both space and the Czech Republic, from which this sample comes, referring this time to a second wife, Elena Caillois, who was from that part of the world. And on this moldavite, we also find diamonds and platinum mountings. If my memory serves me well, we also find the Southern Cross, a constellation that you see from the Southern Hemisphere. We see again the relationship with Latin America, but also the name of the collection published by Gallimard that he developed for South American literature. And so we also find on the sword a stained glass window of gems, where with transparency and different colors, a motif is formed, but for which we have no explanation. So there's still a kind of mystery about this symbolism. Absolutely. And there we see there was the sword presentation ceremony, of course, in the Gallimard salons just before the grand ceremony, where Roger Caillois was finally able to don his great Académie member's robe and his ceremonial sword at the Académie Française. Another important point for Roger Caillois was painted nature. Yes, as he said in Latin, natura pictrix. It was to be a theme that he developed from the 1960s onwards because he was an art historian, among other things, and so he was very interested in seeing the cross-references that can exist between the productions of nature and certain paintings. And especially, he took the opportunity to have a little jab at Marcel Duchamp, who is the author of that famous painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, which currently exists in 3 versions, all 3 at the Philadelphia Museum. And he found a Tuscan limestone, a curator, with black dendrites. And he found that this limestone is actually a kind of premonition of Marcel Duchamp's painting. Some 50 million years before Marcel Duchamp. There we clearly feel the little jabs, the erudition and Roger Caillois' perspective on art history, on artists, on contemporary creation, and how he reframes it in relation to geodiversity, this diversity of stones. But nevertheless, he would try his hand at being an artist. Yes, indeed, that's very true, Laetitia. He was invited by Katia Granoff, the great Parisian gallery owner, who in the 1960s spotted all the creative avant-garde of Paris, still on the left bank, and precisely Roger. She proposed to Roger Caillois that she should exhibit what he does in the intimacy of his office. These are constructions. He was gluing minerals one on top of the other and called them secret sculptures. And because he didn't dare to show them too much, you see, that's why he called them secret. He was a little scared, but he felt like an artist, and the exhibition was a relative success, but not overly successful. And Roger Caillois was no doubt fairly disappointed that there weren't more articles written or more reactions, more feedback. And finally, these sculptures returned to his home. Very few people were to see them. And then they were disassembled until the time when they returned to the museum, thanks, among other things, to the patronage of the École in 2017. We were able to recompose some of them, and we're presenting them for the first time here at the École in the Merci Argenteau location. And how were you able to trace these sculptures? Well, luckily, we had historical photos of Roger Caillois' shelves, plus the documentation of this exhibition at Katia Granoff's in March to April 1965. In some cases, I was not able to reconstruct them immediately, but I remember one in particular. It was called Faux Bondisson, that's leaping wild animal in French, which is a gogotte, a concretion of Fontainebleau sandstone glued onto a Mexican agate. So we see that these are stones that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. This is truly a purely creative assembly. And I remember the day when they were both in 2 different drawers, and suddenly it dawned on me. I thought to myself, you two, I recognize you. And I put them together, and in putting them together, I saw the trace of the glue. So that was it. And so it is through the work of mounting that the secret sculptures were able to make a comeback for this exhibition. Yes, we were able to reassemble them so that visitors could see them, and the reaction of visitors in 2026 is truly incredible. So Roger Caillois was really avant-garde, like Katia Granoff, and all avant-gardists are, of course, always before their time. So in Caillois, we see the importance of inspiration by images, and that the subjects that stones can inspire, which are not at all mineralogical or geological, are very important. And he used a phrase by Mallarmé, a French writer, the demon of analogy. What is interesting is that he does not seek to be a mineralogist. We see this in the preface to some of his works, where he refuses to be a mineralogist or to be interested in the science behind these stones. And so he classified them or looked at them with another eye. And so it wasn't the physical chemical classification or the structure of a crystallographer, a spectrographer, a mineralogist. It was the shape and the color that he was interested in. So there we clearly see the circle and the triangle. But what's interesting is that in the end of the day, this circle and this triangle are due to the process of formation of the stones. So ultimately, science still catches up with them. From this point of view, it is only right, knowing that the apparent shapes and colors of crystals have been used from antiquity until the development of modern science to give names to stones and to classify them. If we look at Pliny the Elder or Theophrastus, he is part of this lineage. So in the end, science still caught up with him. Well, a form of science. And of course, he immediately started to observe writings in the stones. Exactly. So here we have two examples with precisely materials where we have the impression of seeing writing, calligraphy, sometimes even erasures in other examples. And that's really the difficulty. We want to see that, you see. Hence the demon of analogy, as it's been called, whereas it is not analogy. And so it is also a questioning of the materiality of the stone, since we're not facing a sheet of paper. Yes, that's very true, Laetitia. Caillois explains very well that as soon as we see a pattern in a stone, our imagination kind of gets carried away. We have the impression of seeing something that reminds us of a past event, that reminds us of our own psyche and our own cognitive state. But Caillois always backtracks. He's always very lucid, very clear-sighted, hence the demon of analogy. What do I mean? Well, we make analogies, but Caillois always remains very lucid and clear-sighted. With this demon, like Mallarmé, in fact, we effectively return, as you say, to a relativism regarding all these imaginations that our brain indicates to us. Another of his sources of inspiration are the great open spaces that come from his travels in South America, and more particularly the period between 1939 and 1945. As he was in exile, he found himself in South America, in Argentina, at the time of the events in France, and he could not return to the continent of Europe, so he spent this period in exile in South America. He discovered Patagonia, the great desert spaces, and at the time he was not yet collecting stones. He had a quartz that was taken from him, all right, at Brazilian customs in 1942, but he only started collecting really in the 1950s. But quartz would become for him the symbol of lost treasure, and through his collection we can perceive the great open spaces and the memories of his travels in Patagonia in South America, where he discovered both the hot deserts of northern Patagonia, but also the cold and icy deserts of Tierra del Fuego in Chile. And so Tuscany, which this time is not the inspiration of the region as such, but of paesinas that come from Tuscany, which are sometimes also called Florence marble or Tuscany marble, or in English often ruin marbles, which really gives the idea of these ruins or these landscapes that can be seen in these stones. And these stones are not really an inspiration from the region, as I said, but rather along the lines of Leonardo da Vinci, who explained that by looking at a wall or the stains or the arrangement of the stones, one can see landscapes, battlefields, and thus be inspired and nurtured by the stones in this way. Paesinas, which were sometimes used as a painting substrate, by the way, too. One would paint characters to give the impression of a battlefield, a siege, and so one can see a certain number of landscapes depending on our inspiration, really. Among others, in one of the stones in Roger Caillois' collection, there is the limestone piece called Entrance to the Cave. Yes, it's limestone, where we clearly see this flooded cave with at the back a kind of almost unsettling black sun. but it is almost like a stage which has been set, which will lead to a distant place where an unknown plot will be played out. But indeed, when one has a little imagination, one sees many things, as Leonardo da Vinci very rightly says, but things that belong to our own cultural heritage. So the people of Tuscany tended to see familiar landscapes in these paesinas and stones of Tuscany more generally. Like, for example, neighboring towns reminiscent of San Gimignano to us, for example, the small fortified medieval villages of Tuscany to the north of Florence. And it's true that caves often have a rather rich symbolic link to, whether from a religious point of view or with respect to the dragon or the monster that may be hiding there. So there's also a strong symbolism that must surely resonate with Roger Caillois, who is also a historian of religions, of course. Absolutely. And moreover, another one that we show you here shows a paesina that Roger Caillois named Pierre à Masure, cottage stone. It reminded him of the ruins of the town of Reims, which had been bombed in 1913 when he came there. He was very young at the time, before the town was rebuilt between 1920 and 1925. You remember that as a young child, he wandered through the ruins of the town of Reims, which had been martyred by the Prussian bombings. And that's why he had this idea of also calling these limestones ruin limestones, because it reminded him of something very powerful. We're therefore in the second part of the exhibition now to talk about these inspirations, and one of the important inspirations is Asia and China. Yes, China, the discovery of the writings, the paintings and the calligraphy of Chinese literati, that was to be truly fundamental for Roger Caillois in the 1960s. He thus discovered the works of a Chinese superstar of the 11th to 12th century, a person called Mi Fu, who is still today in China the greatest literati, the greatest scholar that China has known. Among the Chinese, almost everybody knows Mi Fu, that he was a poet, a calligrapher, a painter, and through all these artistic productions, Roger Caillois realized that not only did he have these literary and artistic talents, but in addition, he collected stones. Not carved stones or crafted stones or sculptures or gems, but stones in their natural state. And he went even further. He wrote very particular poems about these stones, and certain pieces of poetry, certain excerpts of poetry, were to be absolutely revealing for Caillois. Since at one point, Mi Fu, in one of his texts, speaks of spiritual journeys he makes by observing stones from his collection. And these spiritual journeys were translated into French as randonnées mystiques, mystical walks, because in Chinese it's spiritual journeys, it's the term used. But in 1962, this is the translation that Roger Caillois was to choose, randonnée mystique. This mixture of walking and mystical will resonate perfectly with the spirit of Roger Caillois. He was then able to have the same dreams and the same mystical walks. And in these stones, there was one stone among many others from Mi Fu's collection, which is very famous, even today in China, Laetitia. It's Yanshan, from the Biojin workshop. It's an ink stone, in fact, but it is symbolic. It's a stone with peaks and with these poetic annotations that Mi Fu had inscribed on the historical engravings of the time. That is, Chinese ones, which greatly inspired Roger Caillois in the sense that he realized that he was not the first to associate stone, poetry and writing. The Chinese literati had preceded him, and using these engravings we tried to reconstruct the stone, because unfortunately it disappeared in 1791 and has not reappeared since. So it is mysterious in a way. It's mythical in the literal sense of the term, and so thanks to artificial intelligence now, using a whole compilation of various engravings, we've been able to try to reconstruct it. It was sculpted in a black limestone from southern China, a Yinde limestone, and it was about 25 centimeters wide by about 20 centimeters high. Another source of inspiration for Roger Caillois was Japan. Yes, we can see Roger Caillois talking about Japan on the mineral, this crystallization of calcites that comes from northern Mexico, the Charcas mine, because for Caillois, although the stone is of Mexican origin, it reminds him of a Shinto priest. And so he wrote in his opus of 1975, Pierre Réfléchie, a very beautiful text called The Celebrant, in which he describes precisely this Japanese Shinto priest in his large, white, very wide, starched robe, ready, as Roger Caillois says, to celebrate the liturgical dramas. And then Japan was also to be a great passion, not just a passion, but a great passion for Roger Caillois. We said earlier that his book L'Écriture des Pierres had been translated into Japanese during his lifetime in 1976, which was an extremely rare occurrence. He was to enjoy a second honor in 1978 to 1979, just before he died. He was to see the proofs of this book, which is a gigantic box set, 70 centimeters long, weighing 15 kilos, composed of 3 books, of which one book in particular contains Roger Caillois' texts inscribed in Japanese and French with a pearlescent ink. Such is the subtlety of this book. And they're supplemented by calligraphies by the great Japanese master Shigeo Morita, which are in the second work. Then the third work of the box set is a document explaining this book. This book is of an unheard of elegance and luxury in the Japanese style, and it went on to win the prize for the most beautiful art book at the Tokyo Salon in 1979. Unfortunately, Roger Caillois was not to see the final publication of this book as he died a few months before. And here we are now in the third part of the exhibition and close to the end of it to talk about anagogical stones. But perhaps we can start by explaining what anagogy is. It's not a common term. No, it's a very rare term, in fact. Here again we find Roger Caillois' very extensive knowledge of French vocabulary. Anagogy was a term defined by the ancient Greeks. It explains and describes the ecstasy that humans experience when they look up to the heavens towards the deities of Olympus. But for Roger Caillois, anagogy was more a medieval notion, the elevation of the human gaze, this time towards a single god. And so there was a museum document that put you on the trail of this manuscript, but how did you discover it? I think it was in 2023, is that right? Yes, indeed, that's right. This document, the first document that alluded to the anagogical stones manuscripts, had been donated and was in the museum's deed of donation in 1985, but I never found the document at the museum. I don't know where it went. So I searched for a very long time for a text called Pierre Anagogique by Roger Caillois, until the time in 2023, when I wasn't expecting it in the least, I stumbled upon a crate of documents, and Pierre Anagogique was right there in the middle of them. So that closed the 20-year-long investigation, which enabled me to find this text, and also Roger Caillois' motivations and notes explaining his motivations via anagogy, and which stones particularly interested him to explain his own anagogy. So it's a document you found in Vichy. Yes, it's a document that was indeed exhumed, which was in crates at the Valérie Larbaud Media Library in Vichy, and was known to them in 2023. But the inventory had not been done because there were documents in some disarray, archives of the writer. And that required some classification work, which we did. And so you were able to compare them with the pieces from Roger Caillois' collection. Yes, there was not only the text Pierre Anagogique, but Roger Caillois in another text mentioned 3 pseudo-didactic agates. And similarly, I'd been searching for this text for a long time and found it in 2023. And in particular, among these 3 agates, the second one, called Mutation, is an absolutely extraordinary agate. We can see it in the display case next to your Laetitia. And the fact is, we didn't have the reading directions, so I'd put it the other way around until I came across the text, which allows us to read it as Roger Caillois wanted, or at least intended. Well, listening to you talk about these stones gives us an interesting perspective. Often it's indeed a question of the orientation of the stones, but also the front and back dimension. And in the exhibition, there are certain pieces that can be seen from both sides, thanks to the scenography. And somewhere to understand them, you really need to look at them in the right direction, as you've shown them, as stones call to mind so many things for each of us. We can see in them many, many things that are not necessarily those that Roger Caillois wanted to highlight. So I just had to turn the stone over, and then I started to see what he was saying. I remember it was on the train in Normandy. I was struggling with this text. I couldn't find the agate until I turned it over. Then I understood that it was these two white shadows advancing on the path along a mountain, with in the distance a moon, a white moon, and a whole mountain relief, an absolutely magnificent text. And we can perceive the mountain and the trees on the slope. Yeah, otherwise there's another important agate as well, the paillasse, which up to now was known as petit fantôme, little ghost. But you were able to rename it. It's also just beside us here. You'll tell us more about what the paillasse is. But it's true that we can imagine that Roger Caillois, who lived in South America, knew that in Brazilian they refer to a clown as payaso. So there's probably also a wink and a nod here to other languages. Yes, le paillasse, not la paillasse, of course, with the capital P. It's this major character from the great French drama works by Molière in particular. And although this character's title is less well known than the Palacio of the Italian Commedia dell'arte, in fact, by naming a few characters from Molière's plays, we'll immediately understand who the paillasse is. I'm thinking of Scapin or Sganarelle, colorful characters from Molière's great French plays. And then there are also the polyhedral agates. These very particular agates, which were discovered in the 1970s in Brazil, more precisely in the state of Paraíba, which is in the Nordeste region, in the northeast of Brazil. These agates are really strange and intriguing because they have this clear polyhedral shape. It's never the same polyhedral shape. We have trapeze-shaped ones, rhombuses, triangles, different shapes. And at the time in the 1970s, they challenged the scientific community. Were they natural, first of all? Yes was the answer to that. But does that simply imply then that agate, which we've always considered to be microcrystalline, that is full of small aggregates of very small crystals, does it imply that it's microcrystalline, or is it a crystal after all? Well, that's not the case. It doesn't call that into question, but it raised a lot of questions, and it is, in fact, from a mineralogical point of view, a paradox, which surely inspired Roger Caillois' imagination about these famous paradoxical agates, and in particular a despotic paradox, because he was to write a lot about them. It intrigued him a lot, and indeed even today we don't know exactly how they were formed. There is only one large deposit in the world, and it has since been covered by a dam lake. So they're much older than the agates we know from southern Brazil. These are about 300 million years old, and they're absolutely magnificent. And in the exhibition, we see a very beautiful collection of them. Roger Caillois had the intuition to be able to buy a large quantity at the time they arrived on the market, because nowadays the only pieces to be found are in old collections. Exactly. We'll also find paisinas, limestone paisinas in Pierre Anagogic. But this time it's not by following in Leonardo da Vinci's steps, it's a much more poetic approach. With, for example, this one, which was also named Geological Solitude 1, since there are also 2 and 3, where we'll find opposite them Roger Caillois' text, where, among other things, the white vein inspired him as being lightning striking the earth, and a meteorite. And in particular, on this paisina, which had been received at the museum in the 1980s as a donation. But it was, as I said, orphaned of poetry and titles, unlike some others. And thanks to the discovery of these archives in Vichy in 2023, we were able, as you say, to find this title, and especially a text that is absolutely admirable, where indeed Roger Caillois no longer looks at them as a sociologist, an art historian or historian of religions, as he looked at the paisinas of the Renaissance, but here he looks at them as a pure poet. We could mention this agate, the vessel, but in truth, wouldn't it be called interregnum, maybe? Yes, indeed. I associated it with the text I found in the same archives, an unpublished text, one more again, called Antirène, and which seems to describe this agate, which she also calls arc, hence the connotation with the vessel, which represents the earth, in fact, not in its round spherical shape, but in the fact that this arc will be impacted by all the vicissitudes, as Roger Caillois says, that humanity inflicts on nature and on planet Earth, the planet which preceded us and will succeed us, since he describes mankind running into a brick wall, as they say, by over-exploiting natural resources and leaving traces of our pollution behind us. And he says that through this agate, we see precisely all these impurities that sediment in this arc that this absolutely splendid agate represents. But Roger Caillois in the 1970s was one of those pioneers who already had this environmental vision that is so relevant today. And then an agate, perhaps the last one, the two-way mirror agate. Yes, we are truly in the heart of anagogical stones here, with this two-way mirror. And another agate, indeed, which had been named by Roger Caillois, Pierre Prescrite, prescribed stone, in which we have the impression of seeing, above all, stratifications in the agate. With cameos of blue, we see a kind of sea with reflections. But what Caillois tells us what we must go and see, therefore, is rather the sky above, a dark, stormy sky, of which allows us to glimpse a bright spell, a nascent sun, which I think for Caillois is a vision of the other world, since he is coming closer to it, because it's only a few weeks now before his death. He'd already had a first stroke in early December, and he would unfortunately have a second one, but he was still able to finish writing this text, especially with the second one you mentioned, Laetitia, Miroir sans teint, two-way mirror in French. You see, it's a very simple agate compared to the other one. The previous one has no layering. It's very simple. It's simply a small black dot that Roger Caillois defined admirably. The flight of imponderable confetti, simulating for him precisely the confetti that are no longer attracted by gravity, that are in levitation, that have already passed into the other world, that are no longer subject to earthly constraints. And which for Roger Caillois is a premonition of what awaits him soon. The other world, there's another world that he awaits firmly, calmly, but surely. And so it is these texts that you have found and compared with the stones that were the subject of a book called Pierre Anagogical, with precisely this agate, Pierre Prescrite, which is on the cover, a book that has received the Transfuge Prize for Art Books in 2026. So how can we conclude this conference if not with the words of Roger Caillois, who tells us this? The vain scarecrows that simulate on their side the pensive species provide effective deterrence to the closed and taciturn beauty which a sleepwalking matter invented in days of yore, before the human vicissitude began. That's a very beautiful summary, I think, Laetitia, of everything we've just said, and of Roger Caillois' vision, which may seem a little pessimistic, but in the end of the day, he was imbued with great humanity. Thank you, Laetitia. Thank you, François.